The air in Manhattan carried the scent of money that spring morning in 1912, leather from freshly polished carriages, cigars imported from Havana, the faint perfume of hothouse orchids that bloomed in conservatories behind limestone facades, along Fifth Avenue, where the wealthy paraded their fortunes in marble and granite. One name towered above all others. Astor, not just wealthy, not merely rich, but possessed of a fortune so vast that it bent the very architecture of the city to its will. John Jacob Astor IV stood at the apex of American aristocracy, a man whose annual income exceeded $10 million, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, approaches $300 million. Today, his real estate holdings sprawled across Manhattan like a feudal empire. His name opened every door. His word moved markets. And on the morning of April 15, 1912, as the sun rose over New York, he was already dead, his body floating in the North Atlantic, still dressed in evening clothes, his pockets heavy with gold, a platinum watch that had stopped at the exact moment the cold claimed him. But this is not a story about death. Not yet. This is a story about what wealth can build, what it cannot buy, and the haunting question of whether a man who owned half of Manhattan ever truly owned anything at all. Because before John Jacob Astor IV became the richest casualty of the Titanic disaster, before his young pregnant wife, Madeline, became the most controversial widow in America, before the lawsuits and the scandals and the bitter inheritance battles that would consume his estate for decades, before all of that, there were the mansions, towering monuments to ambition, architectural statements so bold they redefined what American wealth could look like. And every single one of them carried a price far greater than the construction costs itemized in yellowed ledgers. The Astor fortune did not begin with John Jacob IV. It began with fur, beaver pelts to be precise, traded from Native American trappers in the frontier wilderness of the early 1800s. The original John Jacob Astor the great-grandfather arrived in America with nothing, speaking broken English, his pockets empty. He died the richest man in the nation, worth an estimated $20 million in 1848, the equivalent of over $700 million today. He achieved this through ruthlessness that bordered on genius. He bought land when it was worthless swampland on the edges of civilization. He held it, he waited, and when the city grew, when Manhattan expanded northward like an inexorable tide, he collected rents. Generation after generation, the Astor fortune became a self-perpetuating machine, converting time into money, converting land into dynasties. By the time John Jacob Astor IV inherited this empire, the family had already established itself as American royalty. But there was a problem, a psychological fracture that ran through the entire American aristocracy of the Gilded Age. They were wealthy beyond measure, yes, but they were not European nobility. They had no ancient castles, no hereditary titles, no thousand-year lineages traced back to Charlemagne. What they had was money, and money, in the late 19th century, could buy something almost as good as aristocratic blood. It could buy architecture. The mansions began as statements of arrival. They ended as monuments to hubris. Consider the Astor House, the original family seat, a modest enough name for what was essentially a palace occupying the entire block front on Lafayette Place. But by the 1890s, modest was no longer acceptable. The Vanderbilts had built Shatocks that dwarfed European palaces. The Carnegies, the Fricks, the Morgans, all of them were engaged in an arms race of marble and gold leaf. John Jacob Astor IV, who had inherited not just wealth, but the burden of maintaining the family's position at the summit of society, understood what was required. He commissioned not one mansion but several, each more elaborate than the last, each designed to send a message. The Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue at 65th Street rose like a Renaissance palazzo, transplanted whole from Florence. 65 rooms, ballrooms with ceilings painted by European masters, a library housing first editions worth fortunes. But more importantly, it housed a way of life. A staff of 30, 7 servants maintained the residence year-round, footmen in livery, ladies' maids who earned $12 a month, a head butler whose annual salary of $800 represented more than most working families earned in a year. The operating costs of the mansion, just the daily maintenance, the coal for heating, the gas for lighting, the fresh flowers delivered daily, the food prepared in kitchens larger than most family homes, exceeded $50,000 annually, over $1.5 million in today's terms, just to keep the doors open. But the Fifth Avenue mansion was merely the winter residence, the real statement, the architectural declaration that cemented Astor's position as a titan of the age, stood in Newport, Rhode Island. Beechwood, Newport in the Gilded Age, was not a place. It was a proving ground. The summer cottages built by America's wealthiest families were anything but modest. The breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt Roman II, contained 70 rooms and cost $7 million, over $200 million today. Marble House, built by William K. Vanderbilt, was given as a birthday present to his wife, a 45-room temple to excess, wrapped in marble so white it hurt the eyes in summer sunshine. These were not homes, they were declarations of economic dominance rendered in stone and gilt. John Jacob Astor Roman IV understood the game. Beechwood, the Astor summer residence, sprawled across 11 acres of prime Newport coastline. The mansion itself contained 40 rooms, though room is an inadequate word for spaces designed to accommodate hundreds of guests during the legendary balls that defined the Newport season. The ballroom could hold 400 dancers. The dining room could seat 60 at a single table. The conservatory, a glass cathedral dedicated to rare orchids and tropical plants, required 3 full-time gardeners just to maintain. The property included a private beach, stables for 20 horses, and quarters for a staff of 42. If you're wondering what it means to maintain such a place, what it costs in both money and human labor, that curiosity is worth honoring. These stories require following the money to places most histories ignore, the invisible architecture beneath the visible grandeur. The financial mechanics of extreme wealth operate differently than ordinary prosperity. When your annual income exceeds what most people will earn in a lifetime, the normal rules of asset allocation and capital preservation no longer apply. John Jacob Astor Roman IV collected an estimated rental income of $5 million per year from his Manhattan properties alone. This did not include his investments in hotels. He built the Astoria Hotel, which later merged with the Waldorf to create the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most famous luxury hotels in the world. It did not include his railroad investments, his banking interests, his share of various industrial trusts. The money flowed in like a river that could never run dry, but rivers do run dry, not through drought, but through diversion. And the mansions diverted enormous streams of capital into maintenance that generated no return. This was spending for the sake of status, liquidity converted into marble and bronze that could not easily be liquidated again. The Gilded Age aristocracy understood this. They accepted it as the cost of their position, because in their world, wealth was not measured merely in dollars. It was measured in social dominance, in the power to determine who was in and who was out, in the ability to throw a ball so spectacular that newspapers would cover it for weeks. that photographers would capture images that would be reproduced across America, cementing your family position at the apex of society. The balls at Beechwood became legendary. The summer season of 1899 featured an August gala that cost an estimated $200,000, nearly $7 million today, for a single evening. Champagne flowed from fountains. Lobsters were shipped live from Maine. An orchestra of 40 musicians played in the ballroom while guests, dressed in gowns worth fortunes and jewels borrowed from bank vaults, danced until dawn. The guest list determined social fates. An invitation to Beechwood meant you had arrived. Exclusion meant social death. But beneath the music and the laughter and the clink of crystal, beneath the carefully orchestrated spectacle of wealth on display, there existed another world entirely. The servants' world, and it is here, in the spaces below stairs and behind green baize doors, that the true cost of such magnificence becomes visible. Mary O'Brien arrived at Beechwood in the spring of 1907. She was 16 years old, fresh from Ireland, speaking English with an accent that marked her as foreign, as other, as exploitable. She had been hired as a scullery maid, the lowest position in the household hierarchy, responsible for scrubbing pots in kitchens that became infernally hot during the summer months. Her wage was $7 a month. She worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, 7 days a week during the season. Her room, shared with 2 other maids, was a converted storage space in the attic where summer temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. She was forbidden to speak to guests. She was forbidden to use the main stairs. She was forbidden to make eye contact with the family. Mary O'Brien was one of 42. There was Margaret Chen, a Chinese immigrant hired as a laundress for $8 monthly, working in the steam-filled laundry rooms where sheets the size of sails had to be washed, starched, and pressed by hand. There was Thomas Kowalski, a Polish groundskeeper who maintained the gardens for $10 a month, his hands permanently stained green from the chemicals used to keep the lawns impossibly perfect. There was Sarah Johnson, a black seamstress hired for $12 monthly to maintain the family's wardrobes, sitting for 16 hours a day in a windowless room, her eyesight failing by age, 30 from the close work by inadequate light. These were not just servants. They were the invisible infrastructure that made such lives possible. Without them, the mansions would have fallen silent. The gardens would have withered, the illusion would have collapsed. They were essential, and they were erased. Most of them do not appear in photographs. Their names exist only in payroll ledgers preserved by accident in archives. When historians write about the Gilded Age, they write about the Astors. They rarely write about Mary O'Brien. This erasure was not accidental, it was structural. The entire social architecture of the Gilded Age depended on rendering the labor invisible, on creating the illusion that such magnificence simply existed, fully formed, without effort or cost. The guests who arrived at Beechwood for those legendary balls saw only the finished product. They did not see the scullery maids who had scrubbed the floors on their hands and knees. They did not see the footmen who had polished every piece of silver until their hands bled. They did not see the cooks who had worked for 72 straight hours to prepare the feast. The invisibility was the point. John Jacob Astor IV was not a monster. By the standards of his class, he was actually considered relatively progressive. He paid his servants on time. He provided basic medical care when they fell ill. He did not physically abuse them, which, tragically, was enough to earn a reputation for decency in that era. But he also did not question the system. He accepted it as natural, as the way things were, and would always be. He lived in a world where some people were born to command vast estates and others were born to scrub the floors of those estates, and the gulf between those positions was as unbridgeable as the ocean. That ocean, of course, would eventually claim him. But before we reach that April night in 1912, before the iceberg and the lifeboats and the long fall into dark water, we must understand what was happening to John Jacob Astor IV's life in the years leading up to his final voyage, because the tragedy of the Titanic was not his only tragedy. It was merely the conclusion of a longer, slower disaster that had been unfolding for years. In 1909, John Jacob Astor IV divorced his wife of 18 years, Ava Lowell Willing. The divorce was a scandal that consumed New York society. Divorce among the aristocracy was rare, not because marriages were happy, they frequently were not, but because the social cost was enormous. Ava was granted custody of their 2 children and an annual settlement of $200,000, an astronomical sum that nonetheless represented a tiny fraction of Astor's wealth. The divorce freed him legally, but it made him a pariah in the very social circles he had worked so hard to dominate. And then, in 1911, he made it worse. He fell in love with Madeleine Force. She was 18 years old, beautiful, vivacious, from a respectable but not wealthy family. He was 47. The age difference alone would have been scandalous. But more damaging was the timing. In the rigid social code of the era, a divorced man was supposed to retreat from society, to live quietly, to accept his fallen status. Instead, Astor courted Madeleine openly, defiantly. They were married in September 1911, and the scandal exploded. The very society that had once fought for invitations to beach would now turn on him, doors closed. Invitations were withdrawn. Caroline Astor, the reigning matriarch of New York society and John Jacob's mother, was so mortified that she withdrew from public life entirely. The gossip was vicious, relentless. Newspapers published cartoons depicting Astor as a lecherous old man and Madeleine as a gold digger, despite her family's respectability. The social machinery that Astor had helped construct and maintain with his mansions and his balls and his millions, that machinery now turned against him. So he did what wealthy Americans in crisis have always done. He fled. He and Madeleine embarked on an extended honeymoon to Egypt and Europe, partly to escape the scandal, partly to allow time for society's memory to fade. By April 1912, Madeleine was 5 months pregnant, and they decided it was time to return home. They booked passage on the newest, most luxurious ship in the world, the Titanic, first class naturally, a suite of rooms that cost $4,350, over $130,000 today, for the crossing. Even in exile, even in disgrace, and Astor traveled in unimaginable style. The night of April 14, 1912, was clear and cold. The ocean was calm, a black mirror reflecting stars. John Jacob Astor IV was in the first-class smoking room, playing cards with other wealthy passengers. Madeleine was already in their suite, preparing for bed. At 11:40 p.m., the ship struck an iceberg. The collision was so subtle that many passengers barely noticed. There was no violent crash, no Hollywood dramatics, just a strange shudder, a grinding sound that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and then silence. Astor went to investigate. He found crew members already moving through the corridors, their faces carefully controlled, but their urgency unmistakable. He returned to Madeleine and told her to dress warmly. They made their way to the boat deck. The lifeboats were being loaded. Women and children first. Astor helped Madeleine into Lifeboat 4. He asked if he could accompany her, given her condition. Second Officer Charles Lightoller refused. The rule was absolute, women and children only, so John Jacob Astor IV stepped back. He lit a cigarette. He stood on the deck of the sinking ship, watching his pregnant 18-year-old wife being lowered into the darkness, and he waited to die. His body was recovered a week later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials sewn into his jacket and by the enormous amount of money found in his pockets, $2,400 in cash, equivalent to over $70,000 today, as if wealth could somehow buy passage even from the ocean floor. He was 47 years old, the richest man on the Titanic, one of the richest men in America, and all his millions could not buy him a seat in a lifeboat. Before we go further, consider what that moment represents. A man who controlled more wealth than entire nations, who could buy anything and anyone, who had shaped the skyline of New York City itself, reduced to absolute powerlessness. If you're still watching this, still following this thread, it's because you sense what lies beneath. That these stories aren't about money. They're about the illusion of control that money creates and the reality that shatters it. The news of Astor's death reached New York on April 15th. The reaction was complex. There was genuine mourning. He was, after all, an iconic figure, and his death was tragic in the classical sense. But there was also something else, a kind of satisfaction, barely concealed beneath the public expressions of grief. The society that had ostracized him for marrying Madeline now reclaimed him in death as one of their own. The scandal was erased. He became a hero, a man who had given his life so that women and children could live. The newspapers that had savaged him months before now published hagiographies. The irony was almost perfect. In death, he was restored to the position his marriage had cost him. But what about the mansions? What happened to Beechwood, to the Fifth Avenue Palace, to the architectural monuments that had defined his place in the world? The inheritance battle began immediately. John Jacob Astor IV left the bulk of his fortune, estimated at $87 million, roughly $3 billion today, in trust for his son Vincent. Madeline, still pregnant with Astor's child, received an annual income of $5 million, but there was a clause. If she remarried, the income would be reduced to a fraction of that amount. It was a common provision in wills of that era, a way of ensuring that family wealth did not pass to outsiders through remarriage. But it also meant that Madeline's freedom was purchased with her widow's weeds. She could remain wealthy as long as she remained alone. She chose freedom. In 1916, she married William Dick, a childhood friend. Her income from the Astor estate was immediately cut to a fraction of its former amount. She had chosen love over money, or at least companionship over isolation. Society, of course, judged her for it. The newspapers that had portrayed her as a gold digger when she married Astor now portrayed her as a disloyal widow for remarrying. She could not win. The social machinery that had destroyed Astor now turned its attention to her, grinding away until she retreated from public life entirely. Vincent Astor inherited everything else. At 20 years old, he became one of the wealthiest young men in America. He also inherited the mansions, and here is where the story takes a turn that reveals something essential about wealth, about architecture, about the sustainability of the entire Gilded Age model. Vincent did not want the mansions. He understood, with a clarity that his father's generation had lacked, that the age of such houses was ending. The operating costs were unsustainable. The staffing requirements were becoming impossible. World War I was already creating labor shortages, and servants who had once accepted $7 a month were now demanding better wages and better conditions. The social purpose of the mansions to establish dominance, to throw balls that cemented status, no longer functioned in a world being rapidly transformed by war, by social change, by new fortunes, being made in industries that dwarfed even the Astor real estate empire. So Vincent began to dismantle his inheritance. Beechwood was closed. The furniture was sold at auction in 1914. The property itself was leased, then eventually sold to someone who converted it into a tourist attraction. The Fifth Avenue mansion was torn down in 1926, replaced by a luxury apartment building. The Astoria Hotel was sold. One by one, the physical manifestations of the Astor Empire were liquidated, converted back into cash, into more liquid assets that could be managed without the crushing overhead of marble and bronze. This was not failure. It was actually a kind of financial wisdom. Vincent understood that his father's generation had made a critical error. They had confused wealth with its display. They had built monuments that consumed fortunes without generating returns. Vincent converted the estate into investments that produced income without the need for 42 servants and $50,000 in annual operating costs. He diversified, he modernized, he abandoned the old aristocratic model in favor of something more sustainable. But something was lost in that transition, not the money. The money grew, if anything. What was lost was the human scale of it all, the sense that wealth existed in physical space, that it could be touched and walked through and experienced. The mansions, for all their excess, for all their injustice, were at least comprehensible. You could point to Beechwood and say, that is what $87 million looks like. But Vincent's investments, stocks, bonds, real estate holdings scattered across the country, were abstract, invisible, impossible to grasp. Wealth had become a number in a ledger, growing silently in vaults and bank accounts, disconnected from any physical reality. And the servants, Mary O'Brien, Margaret Chin, Thomas Kowalski, Sarah Johnson, what happened to them? The historical record offers no answers. They disappear from the archives after 1914. Most likely, they found other positions, other wealthy families who still maintained large staffs, though those opportunities were shrinking. Some probably returned to their home countries. Others probably fell into poverty when age or illness made them unemployable. They had spent their youth maintaining someone else's dream, and they received no pension, no retirement, no acknowledgement beyond a line in a payroll ledger that no one would read for 100 years. This is the human cost that never appears in the architectural histories, in the coffee table books that celebrate Gilded Age mansions as triumphs of design. These buildings were not triumphs. They were parasites, consuming human life to sustain their marble facades and their perfect gardens. Every room represented hours of labor by people who had no choice, whose poverty gave them no leverage to demand better. The mansions were beautiful. They were also monuments to systematic exploitation rendered in stone. If this recognition feels like something more than history, if it touches something in you about the present moment, about the structures we maintain today, that's worth acknowledging. The patterns don't disappear, they just change costumes. There is a house in Newport today that claims to be Beechwood. It operates as a museum, offering tours where actors in period costume pretend to be Gilded Age aristocrats. Tourists pay $25 to walk through rooms that bear only superficial resemblance to the original mansion. Most of the furnishings are reproductions. The real Beechwood, the actual physical structure that John Jacob Astor IV knew, was demolished in 1950 after years of neglect. What stands there now is a reconstruction, a simulacrum, a dis-nil, and version of history scrubbed clean of complexity and cost. This is what happens to the physical remnants of extreme wealth. They become attractions, commodified versions of themselves, selling nostalgia for an era that was never as romantic as the tour guides pretend. The tourists who visit never see the attic rooms where servants slept four to a space no bigger than a closet. They never hear about Mary O'Brien or Thomas Kowalski. They see the ballrooms and the marble and the gilt, and they sigh over the lost elegance of a vanished age. But that age did not vanish because of some natural historical progression, some inevitable march of progress. It vanished because it was unsustainable. The math did not work. The social structure that supported it, the endless supply of desperately poor immigrants willing to work for starvation wages, was being undermined by labor movements, by immigration restrictions, by a slowly growing recognition that human beings were entitled to dignity regardless of their economic value. The mansions fell not because of changing tastes, but because the exploitation that sustained them became gradually, incrementally, slightly less acceptable. John Jacob Astor IV did not live to see this transformation. He died at the apex of the old world, before it crumbled, before the labor strikes and the war and the depression shattered the illusion of permanence. Perhaps that was a mercy. He would not have understood the world that emerged after 1914. He had been raised to believe that wealth conferred not just privilege but responsibility, that the rich were rich because they were somehow better, more capable, more deserving. That belief system collapsed in the trenches of France and in the breadlines of the Depression. But on the night of April 14, 1912, standing on the deck of the Titanic with a cigarette in his hand, watching his wife's lifeboat descend into darkness, he still believed. He believed that the order of things was natural, that his wealth meant something beyond dollars, that his name would endure. His name did endure, but not in the way he imagined. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel survived, though it was relocated and rebuilt. Astor Place in Manhattan still bears the family name, but the mansions are gone. Beechwood is a tourist trap. The Fifth Avenue Palace is a footnote in architectural histories. The fortune Vincent inherited was eventually dissipated through bad investments and family disputes, divided among dozens of descendants until the Astor name no longer carried automatic association. With great wealth, what remains is the story, and the story forces us to ask questions that have no comfortable answers. What is wealth for? If it cannot buy safety on a sinking ship, if it cannot sustain the monuments built to display it, if it cannot protect you from scandal or social destruction, if it cannot even guarantee that your name will be remembered with honor, what is it for? John Jacob Astor IV spent his entire life managing an empire. He built palaces, he employed hundreds, he moved through the world with the absolute confidence of someone who believed money could solve any problem. And then the ship hit the iceberg and none of it mattered. There is a photograph taken aboard the Titanic during the voyage before the sinking. It shows John Jacob Astor and Madeline on the deck, bundled in coats against the April chill. Madeline is smiling, her face young and untroubled. Astor stands beside her, his expression unreadable behind his mustache and his expensive tailoring. He looks dignified, prosperous, secure. The photograph was taken perhaps 2 days before his death. He had no idea, how could he? The ship was unsinkable. That is what everyone said, the engineers had promised. The company had advertised it, and Astor, a man who believed in technology, in progress, in the power of wealth to purchase safety, he had believed it too. But ships sink, mansions crumble, fortunes dissipate, names are forgotten. The only thing that endures is the story, and the questions it forces us to confront. What would you do with such wealth? Would you build a Beechwood, knowing what it cost to maintain? Would you employ a Mary O'Brien at $7 a month, knowing she had no choice but to accept? Would you stand on the deck of a sinking ship and give up your place in a lifeboat, knowing that death was certain and your wealth could not save you? These are not hypothetical questions. They are moral ones, and they do not have easy answers. The trajectory from fur trader to drowned aristocrat took 4 generations. The trajectory from mansion to museum took only 40 years. That speed, that shocking speed at which everything dissolved, is the real lesson. Because the Astors were not unique, they were part of a pattern repeated across American history, from the Dutch patroons to the railroad barons to the tech billionaires of today. Great wealth is accumulated, monuments are built, a generation or two passes, and then the monuments fall, and the wealth either dissipates or transforms into something unrecognizable. If you've made it this far, if you're still processing these layers, you're watching something more than casual content. This is the kind of story that requires hours of research, cross-referencing archives, following the threads that official histories ignore. Support for work like this makes the next story possible, not as a transaction, but as a recognition that depth matters. The comparison is unavoidable. Today's ultra-wealthy build different monuments, not mansions, though some still do that. But rockets to Mars, social media platforms, tech campuses that sprawl across Silicon Valley like digital age beechwoods. And beneath those monuments, there are still servants. They are called gig workers now, contract employees, independent contractors. They deliver the packages and drive the cars and moderate the content and pack the warehouse orders. They are paid more than $7 a month, yes, but adjusted for inflation and cost of living, the math is not so different. They are essential, they are invisible, they have no equity, no security, no pension. When they age out of usefulness, they are discarded. The pattern persists, the names change, the architecture changes. But the fundamental structure, a small number of people controlling vast wealth, built on the invisible labor of a large number of people who have no choice, that structure endures. And so the questions endure. How long can such a system sustain itself? What happens when the math stops working? Who pays the real cost of monuments to ambition? John Jacob Astor IV never had to answer those questions. He died before the bill came due, before the social structure that supported his lifestyle collapsed, before the mansions were demolished and the fortunes were divided and the servants dispersed. He lived in the last moment of certainty, when wealth still seemed permanent and natural and justified. Perhaps that is why his story haunts us, because he represents the end of something, the last gasp of an age that believed money could purchase immortality. But the ocean does not care about money. The iceberg did not ask for his credentials before it tore the hull open. The water did not pause at the first-class cabins. In the end, John Jacob Astor IV died the same way as the stokers and the third-class passengers and the Irish immigrants in steerage. He drowned, the cold took him, and when his body was pulled from the ocean a week later, the money in his pockets was waterlogged and useless, the gold watch was stopped, and the man who had owned half of Manhattan was just another corpse waiting for identification. The mansions he left behind tell a different story than the one he intended. He built them to demonstrate power, to cement his family's position at the summit of American society, to create monuments that would last for generations. Instead, they became cautionary tales about the futility of trying to make wealth permanent, about the human cost of architectural grandeur, about the speed with which everything can crumble. Beechwood today is not a monument to the Astors. It is a monument to forgetting, to the way history sanitizes itself, to the ease with which we erase the uncomfortable truths and preserve only the beautiful surfaces. But those truths remain even when erased. Mary O'Brien existed. She scrubbed pots in 110-degree kitchens for $7 a month. Margaret Chen bent over laundry tubs until her hands were cracked and bleeding. Thomas Kowalski breathed chemicals that shortened his life to keep the lawns impossibly perfect. Sarah Johnson went blind from close work in inadequate light. They built beechwood as surely as the architects and the masons did. Without them, it would have been a beautiful empty shell. With them, it was a machine for converting human life into spectacle. And John Jacob Astor Roman IV, for all his wealth and all his power, was trapped in the same machine. He did not create it. He inherited it, along with the fortune and the name and the burden of maintaining his position. He played the role he was assigned. He built the mansions he was expected to build. He threw the balls he was required to throw. He employed the servants the system demanded. He was enormously privileged, yes, but was he free? Did he ever question whether the game was worth playing? The historical record offers no answers. We know what he built. We know what he owned. We know how he died. But we do not know what he thought in that final moment on the Titanic's deck, watching the lifeboat descend, feeling the ship list beneath his feet. Perhaps he thought of Madeline. Perhaps he thought of his children. Perhaps he thought of nothing at all, simply accepted what was coming with the stoicism expected of a man of his class. Or perhaps, in that moment, he recognized the futility of everything he had spent his life building. The mansions could not save him. The money could not buy him a seat. The name that had opened every door in New York could not open a place in the lifeboat. He was 50 feet from safety, and separated from it by a rule he could not bend or buy or break. For the first time in his life, John Jacob Astor Roman IV had encountered a problem that wealth could not solve. That is the tragedy, not the drowning, though that is tragic enough, but the recognition in those final minutes that everything he had believed about the power of wealth was wrong. That money is not immortality, that monuments crumble, that names are forgotten, that empires built on exploitation eventually collapse under their own moral weight. Before we reach the end, ask yourself this: what monuments are being built in your name? Not literal ones, perhaps. But what systems do you participate in? What structures do you support that operate on someone else's invisible labor? The question is not rhetorical. It is not meant to inspire guilt. It is meant to inspire recognition. Because the pattern that destroyed the Astors, the assumption that certain people are entitled to luxury built on other people's suffering, that pattern did not die with the Gilded Age. It adapted, it evolved, it wears different clothes, but it persists. The houses are gone now. Beechwood is a replica. The Fifth Avenue mansion is an apartment building. The Astoria Hotel was demolished and rebuilt. Even Vincent Astor's more modest townhouse was eventually torn down. There is no physical trace of the Astor Empire left in New York beyond street names and historical plaques. The fortune dissipated. The family split apart. The name became a brand, a marketing tool for luxury real estate and hotels, disconnected from the actual descendants of the original John Jacob Astor. What remains is the ocean, the place where it all ended. The North Atlantic, where John Jacob Astor Roman IV's body floated in the freezing darkness, still dressed in his evening clothes, still carrying his waterlogged fortune in his pockets. The Titanic wreckage sits on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles down, slowly being consumed by rust and bacteria and time. Eventually, it will dissolve entirely, becoming indistinguishable from the sediment, and when that happens, the last physical evidence of John Jacob Astor Roman IV's final voyage will be gone. But the story will remain, because the story is not really about John Jacob Astor Roman IV. It is about a system that created him and destroyed him, that built mansions on suffering and then wondered why the foundations crumbled. It is about the human cost of grandeur, the price of monuments, the futility of trying to make wealth permanent in a world where nothing is permanent. It is about the servants who are always forgotten and the wealthy who are always remembered. even when perhaps they should not be. John Jacob Astor IV was 47 years old when he died. He had been wealthy his entire life. He had never known poverty, never experienced powerlessness, never questioned his right to the fortune he inherited. And then, in the space of 2 hours on a cold April night, he learned that all of it was illusion. The wealth was illusion. Power was illusion. The permanence was illusion. The only thing that was real was the cold water and the darkness and the absolute indifference of the universe to his bank account. That is the lesson of the mansions John Jacob Astor left behind. Not that wealth is evil, that is too simple, but that wealth is temporary and monuments are fragile, and every empire built on the suffering of invisible others will eventually collapse. The only question is how long it takes, and how much damage is done before the fall. The mansions are gone. The fortune is dissipated. The name endures barely as a brand and a story. And somewhere in the archives, in yellowed payroll ledgers that almost no one reads, Mary O'Brien's name appears next to a figure, $7 per month. She is forgotten. He is remembered. But perhaps the lesson is that both deserve better than the system that used them, that neither the servant who had no choice nor the master who thought he had all choices was really free. If this story made you pause, made you question, made you see the past differently, and perhaps the present too, that pause matters. This is what long-form documentary storytelling attempts, not to provide easy answers, but to ask hard questions. Follow the money until it reveals the people who were erased, to look at mansions and see the labor that built them, to recognize that every monument to human achievement is also a monument to human cost, and to ask always who pays that cost and whether the monument is worth it. The questions do not end with the Astors. They echo forward through every generation, through every new fortune, through every new monument. What are we building? Who are we erasing? What will remain when the illusion dissolves and the cold reality crashes through the hull? These are the questions John Jacob Astor IV never asked. These are the questions we must. The ocean keeps its secrets. But the mansions, even in their absence, tell the truth. Wealth is temporary. Power is illusion. And the only thing that endures is the story, and the responsibility to tell it honestly, completely, without sanitizing the cost or romanticizing the grandeur. That is the tragedy of the Titanic's richest man. Not that he died, we all die, but that he lived his entire life inside a beautiful lie and only realized it was a lie in the moment it was too late to matter. The mansions are gone, the questions remain, and that, perhaps, is as it should be.